There is a river in northeastern British Columbia that carried life long before Canada existed as a country. For thousands of years, the Danza and Treaty 8 First Nations hunted along it, fished from it, buried their ancestors beside it, and built entire generations around its rhythm. That river was the Peace River, and today, much of it is gone. Not dried up, not diverted, drowned. More than 128 kilometers of the Peace River Valley and its tributaries now sit beneath rising reservoir water created by the Site C hydroelectric dam, a massive artificial lake stretching across land that once held farms, forests, wildlife corridors, burial grounds, and communities with histories older than the Canadian state itself. The reservoir covers roughly 9,330 hectares. That is nearly 5 times the size of Victoria, British Columbia's capital city. And whether you see Site C as a masterpiece of clean energy engineering or as one of the most destructive acts of modern Canadian development, one thing is undeniable. This is one of the most important infrastructure projects built anywhere in North America in the last half-century. Because Site C is not just a dam, it is a symbol of what happens when energy security, climate policy, artificial intelligence, indigenous rights, geopolitics, and economic desperation all collide in the same place at the same time. And now, in 2026, that collision is beginning to reshape the balance of power across the continent. Let's begin with the raw scale of what Canada actually built. The Site C Dam cost approximately 16 billion Canadian dollars. That makes it the most expensive public infrastructure project in British Columbia's history. It is also the most expensive dam ever built in Canadian history. And that number matters because Site C was never supposed to cost anywhere near that much. The original estimate was around $6 billion. By the end, the project had ballooned to nearly 3 times its projected cost. That is not a normal overrun. That is the kind of escalation that destroys governments, triggers investigations, and becomes a textbook example in university courses about megaproject failure. Entire political careers have collapsed over smaller mistakes. Yet despite the controversy, despite lawsuits, protests, engineering concerns, environmental warnings, and years of public outrage, the dam was completed. The first generating unit came online in October 2024. The 6th and final turbine entered service in August 2025. Today, all 6 units are operational. Together, they produce 1,100 megawatts of electricity, enough to power roughly 500,000 homes. Its annual output is expected to reach approximately 5,100 gigawatt-hours every year. And here's the crucial part. Unlike coal plants or natural gas facilities, hydroelectric dams do not need fuel shipments. They do not depend on volatile oil prices. They do not rely on global supply chains. Once operational, the river itself becomes the engine, which means Site C now provides British Columbia with massive quantities of continuous, dispatchable, low-carbon electricity at a moment when the world is becoming desperate for exactly that. That timing may end up changing everything. For years, governments talked about the energy transition as if it would unfold slowly, gradually, predictably. Then, artificial intelligence arrived. And suddenly, electricity stopped being just another utility. It became strategic infrastructure. Because modern AI systems consume staggering amounts of power. Training advanced models requires enormous computational facilities filled with servers operating around the clock. And those servers require electricity on a scale most people still do not fully understand. A single large AI data center can consume as much electricity as an entire small city. Not metaphorically, literally. The International Energy Agency now estimates that global data center electricity consumption could more than double within just a few years. By 2026, AI systems, cloud computing, and crypto infrastructure together are expected to consume over 1,000 terawatt-hours annually worldwide. That is roughly equivalent to the electricity demand of major industrialized nations. And the biggest technology companies on Earth are panicking to secure power supplies. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta. All of them need enormous amounts of clean, stable electricity. Not someday, now. Because they made public climate commitments years ago. They promised investors, regulators, and consumers that the future of AI would be powered by renewable energy. But there is one enormous problem. The United States does not currently have enough clean energy infrastructure to meet that demand fast enough. And Canada does. That is where Site C enters the story. Canada already possesses one of the largest hydroelectric systems on Earth. Roughly 60% of the country's electricity generation comes from hydroelectricity. Provinces like Quebec, British Columbia, Manitoba, and Newfoundland possess enormous river systems capable of generating vast quantities of power. In total, Canada has more than 78 gigawatts of installed hydro capacity. And even more importantly, experts estimate Canada still possesses roughly 155 gigawatts of undeveloped hydroelectric potential. That number is almost difficult to comprehend, because in the 20th century, oil was geopolitical power. In the 21st century, clean electricity may become even more valuable, especially electricity capable of powering artificial intelligence. And Canada may be sitting on one of the largest strategic reserves of it anywhere in the developed world. That reality is already reshaping corporate investment decisions. Brookfield Renewable signed agreements capable of delivering thousands of megawatts of hydroelectric capacity to Google's American operations. Microsoft entered massive renewable framework agreements extending into the next decade. The hyperscalers, the giant AI companies building the digital infrastructure of the future, are buying power at astonishing speed. And Canadian hydropower is increasingly central to those deals. Site C was not built specifically for AI, but it may become one of the defining AI infrastructure projects in North America anyway. Because the electricity from this dam will not just power homes, it will power data centers, AI servers, cloud infrastructure, machine learning systems, the digital economy itself. The Peace River is now partially flowing into the future of artificial intelligence. Now we arrive at the geopolitical part of the story. Because in 2025, something happened that exposed a vulnerability many Americans had barely thought about before. Energy tensions between Canada and the United States suddenly escalated during trade disputes involving tariffs on Canadian energy exports. For decades, electricity moved across the border almost invisibly, quietly, reliably. Canadians sold electricity south. Americans bought it. Nobody paid much attention. Then, politics entered the equation. Tariffs were proposed on Canadian energy exports, including electricity. In response, Canadian provincial leaders openly threatened restrictions and retaliatory pricing measures. And suddenly, Washington realized something uncomfortable. The United States genuinely needs Canadian electricity. Canada exports enough electricity to power millions of American homes. States near the border, New York, New England, Minnesota, Washington State, depend heavily on Canadian imports during periods of high demand. And these are not small or insignificant regions. These are some of the wealthiest and most economically productive areas in the United States. More importantly, the North American electrical grid is deeply interconnected. The system was designed over decades for cooperation, which means severe disruptions are not simple. You cannot just turn off electricity exports without risking wider grid instability. That interdependence changes the political equation entirely, because it means electricity is no longer merely trade. It is leverage. And Site C increases Canada's leverage dramatically. Before Site C, British Columbia often imported American electricity during drought years and supply shortages. Now, with the dam fully operational, that dependence is expected to largely disappear. That is a profound strategic shift. British Columbia moves closer to becoming a stable, long-term exporter of clean power, rather than a vulnerable importer. And in an AI-driven economy starving for electricity, exporters gain influence. Fast. And this is where the triumph narrative begins to fracture. Because none of this happened in an empty wilderness. The valley that now sits underwater was not unoccupied land waiting for development. People lived there. People farmed there. People hunted there. People buried loved ones there. The Site C project flooded agricultural land considered some of the most fertile in northern British Columbia. Environmental reviews warned about severe ecological consequences. Habitats for vulnerable species disappeared beneath reservoir water. Traditional hunting and fishing territories used by Treaty 8 First Nations were permanently altered. Burial grounds were submerged. And perhaps most controversially of all, several First Nations argued they never gave meaningful consent. That matters enormously, because Canada publicly committed itself to reconciliation and to the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet critics argued Site C directly contradicted those commitments. International human rights organizations condemned the project. United Nations bodies criticized it. Scholars protested it. Legal challenges attempted to stop it. And still, construction continued. For many Indigenous leaders, the project became symbolic of something much larger than a dam. It represented a familiar historical pattern. Governments deciding that economic priorities justified sacrificing Indigenous land and Indigenous rights. Again, and again, and again. One Indigenous chief described the filling of the reservoir as surreal and devastating, a moment people fought against for years but ultimately could not stop. Not because they lacked arguments, not because they lacked evidence, but because they lacked the billions of dollars required to fight governments indefinitely in court. That statement cuts directly to the heart of the issue. Because infrastructure projects are never only engineering decisions. They are power decisions. Who gets heard? Who gets ignored? Who benefits? Who pays? And who gets sacrificed in the name of national progress? This is what makes Site C so difficult to categorize. Because the dam is simultaneously a clean energy triumph, a geopolitical asset, an engineering achievement, a financial disaster, an environmental controversy, a human rights conflict, and possibly a preview of the future. Because as climate change accelerates and AI demand explodes, countries everywhere are going to face versions of this same question. What are we willing to destroy in order to secure the energy systems of the future? Canada answered that question on the Peace River. It answered with concrete, turbines, flooded valleys, and $16 billion. And now the electricity is flowing. The AI servers are powering up. The transmission lines are humming. The lights stay on. Meanwhile, beneath the reservoir water, entire landscapes disappeared forever. And that is why Site C matters so much. Not because it is simply a dam, but because it reveals the bargain modern civilization may increasingly make: sacrifice local worlds to power global systems. The question is whether history will judge that bargain as visionary or unforgivable.